very concerning. Dozens of suspects are in custody here in Los Angeles following pre-dawn raids targeting the notorious MS-13 gang.
This gang uses coercion and intimidation while inflicting horrific violence in neighborhoods where they operate. Today is a win for justice.
Agents raided at least 24 locations here in the Los Angeles area wearing helmets, bulletproof gear. This was part of a 6-week nationwide operation targeting gangs in cities like New York, D.C., Houston, Atlanta, Newark. Joining me now, Bobby Chacon, former FBI special agent. And I think we have to talk, Bobby, if you don't mind. You can school us a little bit. We've been hearing about MS-13. We know they are brutal, ruthless, notorious. But they sort of seemingly, to the uneducated, popped out of nowhere. I know they started here in Los Angeles, but how did they grow so quickly?
Well, they, there was, most of them fled from the El Salvadoran civil wars in the 80s, and they ended up in Los Angeles. And then it was predominantly an LA problem until, into the 80s and 90s when, some of the other gangs caught the national attention, the Colombians, even the Jamaicans that I worked in New York, the Chinese gangs. And so it could have been as a lack of attention because some of the other more profile gangs were getting the attention at the time that MS-13 was able to export out of Los Angeles to the Midwest and obviously eventually the East Coast and grow. And then their association, of course, with the Mexican Mafia here in Los Angeles really gave them a leg up on things out here.
But I understand there was also a real growth because of the prison system. They grew in prison and then sort of morphed with other gangs. And when people left prison, they suddenly found themselves as part of MS-13 as well.
Right, and that's the association with the Mexican Mafia comes in. The Mexican Mafia is a prison gang that dominates the LA prison system, the California prison system in general. And so they learned early on that they were going to have to hook up and pay tribute to the Mexican Mafia. So their people, when they go to jail, which is actually part of the gang lifestyle, would be protected in jail until they could come back out and, resume their gang activities. And then MS-13 would do favors for the Mexican Mafia that they needed done outside of prison. So it was a very symbiotic relationship, and it helped both gangs grow.
I know there's been a real focus within the FBI to focus on the important counterterrorism efforts in the nation, given the global threats. But has that taken resources away from the gang fighting units? And when you look at these operations that happened, these raids that happened here in Los Angeles and across the country, is that an effective method for going after a group that has such widespread reach, or is it just like a game of whack-a-mole?
Well, obviously resources were diverted. When I was working gangs in New York City for the FBI in the late 80s and into the late 90s, we had 6 or 8 gang squads and drug squads then. That was cut by 75% after 9/11, obviously. Things have come back a little bit now, not fully, obviously, to the heyday of the 80s and 90s, but, it's a resource question. But actually the effectiveness of these large takedowns is actually the more effective method. And I think the state and local partners are recognizing that, and that's what we did way back when I was working them as well. For example, yesterday's takedown, part of the result was a former takedown. The last takedown back in 2014 created a leadership void in MS-13, and nobody really ascended to that because nobody wanted to be the leader and in the spotlight and in the crosshairs of law enforcement. So all the cliques in MS-13 started kind of leading by this leadership council where the different cliques would come together and kind of, form rules and govern kind of that way. So, the effects of this are seen on a lower, street level, in that nobody, after 2014's takedown, nobody ascended to the leadership role. And so they actually decided to operate a little differently. So whenever you can get these groups to operate a little differently, and whenever you can get them to abandon a centralized leadership, it's effective.
Yeah, you're disrupting their organization. Bobby Chacon, always a pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate so much your experience in adding to our conversation here. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.